Welcome back, Focus Learners. We are bringing the high energy today because we're jumping right into a brand new explainer, investigating Marc Bates's fascinating theological and psychological analysis of a viral phenomenon. The paper is called Embodied Allegiance and the Mechanics of Belief. You know that old saying, fake it till you make it? Well, if you've ever wondered if that actually applies to our deepest, most profound convictions, you are in exactly the right place. Let's get into it.
Okay, let's dive into this. The whole analysis centers around this incredibly fascinating case study of a guy named Brian Guan. Now, Brian was a New York-based skeptic and a yoga instructor, and he decided to try a pretty unconventional experiment. He committed to acting as if God were real for exactly 30 days. He was super upfront about it, publicly framing it as pretending. He was basically treating faith not as a list of facts you have to agree with, but as a lifestyle you can take for a test drive. Which of course begs the ultimate mystery: can you literally pretend your way into genuine belief?
To actually test this out, Guan didn't just casually think about it. He committed to a strict daily protocol. Every single day, he engaged in prayer, directed deliberate gratitude toward a higher power, read scripture, and intentionally tried to imitate the merciful actions of Jesus. And honestly, the results were staggering. By the end of those 30 days, Guan transformed from just pretending to making a public confession of faith in Jesus. He also experienced massive lifestyle changes. The most surprising one, an 8-year nicotine addiction just receded. It literally faded away without some huge, agonizing battle of willpower.
Section 1. 2 sequences of knowing. Now that we've covered the what of this viral story, let's pivot to the how and why, framing this as a deep dive into the actual mechanics of belief.
So most of us naturally approach belief through a very modern Western lens. Philosophers call this Cartesian dualism. It's the assumption that you absolutely must be intellectually convinced of something in your head before you change what your physical body does. But the ancient Hebraic model, the epistemology found in the Bible, works quite differently. Think about the Israelites at Mount Sinai. Their response to God wasn't, okay, we'll think about it and let you know. It was, we will do and we will hear. Action and comprehension were one single unified posture.
And this brilliantly illustrates the contrast in those sequences. On the left side, you've got the modern assumption: head first, feeling second, and physical obedience is this sort of optional third step. But look over at the Hebraic sequence on the right. Here, knowing relies on embodied allegiance. That physical action and ritual actually come first. These practices reform our dispositions and what we love, rather than just treating the mind like some disembodied intellect floating in a jar.
Which brings us right to this absolutely crucial Greek word, pistis. Now, we usually just translate this as faith or belief, which can sound a bit like passive intellectual agreement. But scholar Matthew W. Bates defines it way better as covenantal allegiance, or enacted loyalty to the king. Looking at this objectively, doing physical practices isn't about trying to earn your salvation. Not at all. It's about creating an environment for lived loyalty. So essentially, Guan is acting out pistis before his brain had fully caught up.
Section 2. Psychology versus theology. Let's transition into how modern psychology views this acting as if experiment, which sets up our investigation into the cognitive mechanics. Now, what's really interesting about this slide is how perfectly Guan's reported changes map onto established psychological theories. Take a look at Leon Festinger's theory of cognitive dissonance there in the middle. When you do things that conflict with your beliefs, like a skeptic praying every single day, your mind feels intense pressure to find consistency. Or look at James K. Smith's concept of affective habituation. The idea is that what you do with your body trains what you love. Guan's physical routines literally seem to retune his desires over those 30 days.
Theologians actually have a Latin term for what this physical practice accomplishes: coram deo, meaning placing the agent before God. The source is super careful to clarify here. Doing 30 days of journaling and praying doesn't magically manufacture a spiritual regeneration out of thin air. Instead, think of these practices like a corridor. They intentionally place a person right in the presence of a potential giver.
But we have to clarify the absolute limit of psychology here. The source insists that neuroplasticity isn't just rewiring a person's brain into having faith. Instead, these routines interrupt our natural tendency to suppress the truth. By praying and reading ancient texts every day, Guan didn't force a conclusion. What he did was make his suppression of the idea way more expensive to maintain. It was a place of exposure, not a cause.
Section 3. Grace, effort, and promise.
Let's evaluate this experiment within Walter C. Kaiser Jr.'s Promise Plan theology to make sure we avoid both legalism and cheap grace.
To keep all of this balanced, the text neutrally outlines two very clear theological boundaries. First, justification cannot be earned by a 30-day routine. Right standing before God is entirely a gift. But on the flip side, you have Spirit-inscribed sanctification. And this is the active, lived obedience that is actually promised in the New Covenant. It's the obedient walk that naturally follows the gift.
Let's move to and see how this builds, because this gives us two completely different accounts of moral effort. Notice the stark contrast. Legalistic jurisprudence is motivated entirely by fear or a hunger to earn merit. But on the other side, Spirit-inscribed sanctification is driven by gratitude. The purpose isn't to buy a ticket to heaven, it's to express allegiance. And we see this grace-empowered effort broken down perfectly in the Sermon on the Mount's triad. First, a statement of traditional righteousness. Second, a diagnosis of the vicious cycle. And third, a concrete transforming initiative. By actively trying to practice reconciliation and mercy, Guan wasn't doing some self-salvation technique. Actually, scratch that. It's more like he was just stumbling right into these practical, transforming initiatives that Jesus talked about. Section 4, an apologetic of action. Setting up the final phase of our investigation. How does this modern TikTok-style experiment connect to classical arguments for sincere seekers? It turns out, Guan is actually in some excellent historical company here. C.S. Lewis, in his famous Let's Pretend concept, wrote about the strange honesty of saying the words of the Lord's Prayer even when you don't feel them yet. And we can't forget Pascal's wager. These classical thinkers all advocated for a practical, embodied entry into faith. They recognized that sometimes the physical body has to lead the way when the intellect is completely stuck. So the crucial point is that we have to outline the academic safeguards here. The source warns us with 3 strict cautions. First, this requires a completely sincere pursuit, not just contentless mimicry or social media theater. Second, it can never replace historical and apostolic testimony. And third, this path promises light to seekers of communion, not to those demanding absolute Cartesian certainty before taking a step. We have to guard against preparationism and turning spirituality into just another commercialized 30-day content cycle. The author concludes with this brilliant medical school analogy. Imagine trying to evaluate if a medical school is effective. Could you really know if you just sat in the bleachers as a completely detached spectator? Of course not. To truly know diagnostic practice, a student has to participate. So I leave you with this. If testing the Christian hypothesis requires stepping into the light of action, how many of our beliefs are simply the result of refusing to get out of the spectator seats? Think about that for a bit, and we will see you in the next explainer.